Okay, so I will start. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This webinar has been in the planning for some time, although we sort of changed the framing around, and but I think there's a lot of policy professionals in the audience, so hopefully this will be helpful to you. And just so everyone knows, this is being recorded, and we're going to share the slides out and the recording for the next session as well. So I just want to first thank our speakers for joining. None of this would happen without them, and I'm excited to hear from their expertise today. So I'm just gonna give a brief introduction on the event goals and a little bit of the work we've done with a group, the research group that I'm leading, and then turn it over to them. So what we want to provide today is really a vocabulary for you all to be able to discuss why public investments in research and development matter to policymakers, to broad audiences beyond scientists, and illustrate pathways from R&D to economic impact. We'll hear about this from our speakers today. Discuss also the innovation infrastructure and economic calculations needed to drive research forward. And also we'll talk about the workforce, educational pathways, and how we develop this workforce. And then 2 weeks from now, we'll have sort of a practical session based on what we'll discuss today. You all can talk about your research, why R&D matters, and then practice some of that with experts. And then again, the idea is to figure out how to talk about this to non-technical audiences, including policymakers. So just brief introduction. My name is Adriana Bankston. I think I know a lot of folks in the audience, but I've mostly been in federal relations, working to support scientific research in various positions. Also workforce development through a number of roles, including today I'm here with the STEM Advocacy Institute, which is a think tank. We do, like I said, we're doing research on this topic, and we'll show you a little bit of that too. But we'll be hearing from our speakers today, and I just want to introduce them briefly now, and then we'll sort of go through the slides. So we're going to talk about framing the value of R&D using impact pathways from Jeff Alexander, who is the Director of Innovation Policy at RTI International. Then we'll talk about how this federal funding can create both social and private value, specifically looking at basic biomedical research from Fred Ledley, who is a professor and director for Center for Integration of Science, Industry, and Bentley University. And then finally, last but not least, we'll talk about the workforce piece of this, what educational pathways look like, what workforce outcomes look like, global contrasts, and also in the US, from Nimmi Kannankutty, who's the Vice President for Academic Relations at Elsevier, North America. So really, really exciting work here today. We're gonna hear from them. So brief introduction just to some of the work that I've been doing with STEM Advocacy Institute. It is a Massachusetts-based nonprofit. It operates as residents, so we're all sort of either doing research or practitioners as this resident collective. It's a think tank incubator, building tools and programs to expand pathways within science and society. It's been developed by the Civic Science Media Lab, so a lot of different names here. But basically, I lead a policy group that includes a lot of students and trainees, recent graduates in STEM fields who want to advocate for change. And obviously, they've been impacted by the Trump administration. So we started looking into this sort of how the administration has impacted them and through some of the work we're doing here. And again, with the workforce angle here, what is happening sort of with the state of science, brain drain, and all of that. So we published a paper based on a survey that we did, sort of rapid fire survey last year to get some opinions from trainees. And we published this preprint, which is now under review with Frontier. So hopefully we'll be out soon. We also did a webinar, the second panel here, again, to hear from trainees from the group, and was very well attended. And this is part of the goal for this work is to really try to get the voices of folks who are impacted right now and what they're saying and publish some of that data. So just quickly, I'm gonna just show you some of the results from the preprint. You're welcome to look at this in bioRxiv. But again, it was sort of a quick survey to try to look at what trainees were saying through our network. So no real specific goals as far as disciplines. What we ended up getting is most folks who responded are PhD students in the life sciences. We looked at how long they've been in their positions, demographics, which is optional, although everyone responded, but we had majority white folks respond. We asked which agency funded their research, and how severe the funding cuts were, and then sort of what they were planning to do. So I'm showing that here. Majority showed that they had high impact as far as the funding cuts on their careers and research. We also went into all the different types of impacts and concerns they had, how their professional lives were impacted, and then a lot of them, as you can see here, were considering leaving research altogether. So this precipitated a lot of other discussions on that. We also asked them how universities have helped address this crisis and also what Congress can do as far as, are there things that they would want to see there? So again, just a couple of pieces of data here. And then the types of impacts, again, we asked a lot of questions about this. Responses that we got were, their stipends and cuts and benefits are impacted. Some universities froze hiring or rescinded offers. So really trying to get at some of what's been happening and what trainees are saying. And not to go into all of this data here, but basically, there are broad concerns about long-term research prospects. A lot of folks are considering going to other countries. They couldn't complete their grants. Their grants were not renewed, couldn't complete their projects. And most of them, again, don't want to, large percentage, again, don't want to stay in research. We also asked about systemic questions. What sorts of things have been impacted beyond pay, right? So mental health and wellness, education, training, belonging, and again, general issues related to their time in science and their future. So this is just brief introduction, kind of priming you to think about, the times that we're in, and how this generation is impacted and what the future of science and STEM looks like, as we're having this conversation today. So we're gonna turn it over to Jeff to discuss a little bit about R&D impact pathways, and then we're gonna go through all our speakers, and then we're going to have questions at the end. So feel free to write them in the chat, and then I'll let Jeff go next. Oh, you're still muted.
I'm still muted. Sorry about that. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to go through my slides pretty briskly, just so we can have some good time for Q&A at the end. So if you can hold your questions, also my contact information is here on these slides, so you can always email me later. But what I'm talking about is what's called the framing of the value of academic research and development. And framing is a term that was used by a linguist, George Lakoff at UC Berkeley, kind of about the vocabulary that you're using. The way you talk about something is often presented in a frame, and the frame actually affects how people interpret what you say and the effect that your language has. And so I'm applying this to my field, which is actually research and development funding program evaluation, to talk about why we should be saying things like the value of research and development and not things like the return on investment. If you advance the slide, my major thesis here is that if you attempt to calculate the financial return on investment from federally funded research, it will produce a misleading, misguided, and incomplete assessment of the actual value generated by that research. And I'll explain that in a minute. A lot of people like to cite this United for Medical Research study that said that I believe for NIH that $1 of the NIH budget produces $2.56 of economic impact. It's a fine study. I know the methodology. I've read it in detail. Two things to keep in mind. People then say, "Oh, well, that means it has a 256% ROI." That's actually incorrect because you have to subtract a dollar, so it's actually 156% ROI using that calculation. You can't say that, okay, if we spent a dollar and got a dollar back, that's not 100% ROI, that's actually 0% ROI. So, but the other problem that you have is that it's basically just taking the extramural funding of NIH, all the grants that NIH gives out, and calculating how much economic activity comes from that spending. So the more you spend, the more ROI you get. It's not really a way of fairly valuing, like, well, why are we spending that money, and does it really reflect the actual value compared to other ways we can use that money? So if you go to the next slide, my statement here is that basically ROI is the wrong frame for us to use. First of all, it makes R&D sound like it's a financial asset, which it really isn't. R&D does not behave like a stock in the stock market, right? It also treats all R&D as fungible. If you have a single ROI, you can say, well, it doesn't matter what we spend the money on. As long as we spend it on R&D, we're going to get this ROI. It also seems to imply that you can calculate a specific return for every single R&D expenditure, which is also not actually true in practice. Another thing is that we often talk about kind of high risk, high return research, which automatically assumes we can measure the riskiness of a research effort, and we actually don't have any way of doing that. So kind of this language that we're adopting from the financial and business world ends up actually undermining our own arguments about why research is important. So in that sense, I tend to prefer to use the term value if you can advance. So if you talk about the value of R&D, one, you should recognize that the value of any R&D effort can vary by the audience, right? If somebody does research in cancer and I'm a cancer patient, that R&D has greater value than if I'm just somebody who doesn't have cancer, right? So we should be thinking about terms of who are we delivering value to? I also, using value, recognizes that value actually varies with time, right? So science that was done 20 years ago could have been very valuable at the time, but that value may decrease as we learn new things. So we should always keep in mind that value can vary based on the context. And it also enables us to talk about things like the fact that negative results actually have positive value. If you do a research experiment and it fails, now you know what doesn't work. And that has value, whereas in the financial world, that would just be viewed as like a waste of money. So this kind of framing, I think, gives a better sense of how you can actually talk about the impact of federally funded research and academic research. If you go to the next slide, I'll give an example of how we do this. So this is from a report that was recently published by the National Science Foundation that was written by my group at RCI. And this was basically trying to set up a model for how you would take the NSF research funding and determine what is the economic impact of that research funding. So again, this is really based on the extramural spending by NSF, but we kind of looked at the fact that, what you spend on basic research is going to have a different kind of impact than what you spend on use-inspired or more applied research, which is also different from the NSF spending on training and education, which is also different from the NSF spending on research infrastructures. And by looking at the actual outputs of each type of spending, you can talk about the specific outcomes associated with that type of research. And from that, you generate differentiated calculations of economic impact by looking at that portfolio and how that portfolio balance changes. So I've applied the same method to a project that we did for the National Institutes of Health, the Office of Technology Transfer, if you can advance the slide. So we were asked by the NIH Intramural Research Program to look at the economic value or the economic and other value of the inventions that were made at NIH. So again, I'm talking here about the research that's done on the NIH campus, not the research grants that NIH gives out to other performers, but what they do at their campus, primarily in Bethesda. This is actually a pretty big enterprise. Back in FY 2024, it was $5 billion of NIH budget. It's research that's conducted in these labs by mostly people who are actually NIH employees or postdoctoral fellows. And the whole purpose of the IRP is to advance basic biomedical knowledge, but also produce knowledge, tools, and expertise that helps the entire R&D system in biomedical research in the United States. And so what we did was working with their technology transfer office, which patents and protects the inventions that are made by NIH scientists and then licenses them to outside parties. We tried to identify, what are those inventions? What did they produce? And then how did the actual downstream technologies and products generate value? If If you go to the next slide. So the way we did this was actually looking at different impact domains, right? So these kind of inventions, right, these basic technologies that can be patented and licensed can produce different types of outcomes depending on the situation. So, for example, there's an innovation outcome where if you're, for example, building research tools, that may not have immediate financial return. In fact, the licensing value of research tools is fairly low. You can license them for a low royalty, but it actually enables future research. And so we need to keep in mind that's a dimension of value. Like you're creating enabling technologies, which then means that we have drugs that we wouldn't otherwise have if we didn't have those tools. You can also think about just the direct economic impact of the sales. So as opposed to the United for Medical Research study, we looked at the sales of the products that were produced that integrated these technologies that were licensed from NIH and the actual economic impact of those products based on their sales value, which gives you a very different measure of economic impact. And finally, we look at public health value in terms of lives saved, kind of days of hospitalization avoided. Fred will talk about that aspect a little bit more. But this idea of having these three different impact domains enables you to look at this in a more granular fashion. So if you go to the next slide, what we do is we look at each of these three domains and then we decompose it into different aspects of that domain. So, for example, the innovation impact of NIH's intramural program, one, it supports startup companies that are doing innovation because they license to startups. It promotes, again, technologies that other companies then actually build on to build their own technologies. For example, also the innovation, the economic impact could be the impact of the sales, but also the people that are hired to sell these products. So what we've done in the study is we look at each of these aspects. We develop quantitative indicators based on the data that corresponds with each aspect. And then we kind of are able to establish the link between here's something that we are able to measure in terms of impact, and this is what type of impact that was produced from the work of the intramural research program. If you go to the next slide. So this is just one example. We looked at all of the research tools. So this is reagents, cell lines, things of that nature that were produced by the IRP and licensed out to outside parties. This is not including licensing to academic labs. It's primarily to private industry labs. And one thing you'll notice at the chart on the right is that some of these tools were licensed many, many times over and to very different performers. So again, this top cell line here, the murine colon 38 cell line, was licensed from 1980 to present 171 times, actually a shorter time frame because it wasn't invented until more recently. But you can see that basically this means that a lot of other labs were using this cell line in their own research. And so the IRP wasn't necessarily directly producing products. That's not the job of NIH. The NIH doesn't actually build products, but it gives you the enabling technologies that enables drug companies to then go out and develop, further pharmaceuticals, interventions, things of that nature. So really what we're trying to say here is that NIH in this particular type of impact is helping build the infrastructure that other research labs use to generate new technologies and new cures and new therapies. So if you go to the next slide, this is just a brief overview of some of the impacts that we discussed. So we looked at, for example, the gross US sales of all the products that the IRP licensed or products using IRP technologies that NIH licensed from 1981 to 2021. Those products generated $130 billion in sales at least. That's actually an underestimate because that's only the sales during the time that the license was active. So even after they went off patent, they continued generating sales, obviously. We identified that there were 75,500 job years, so essentially the support for a job for 1 year over that same time period. You had other things, for example, 1,200 clinical trials that were conducted. So clinical trials are not only about developing new drugs and testing them. Clinical trials themselves are an economic engine because you have to spend money to run the trial. You hire people to administer it. So there are a lot of dimensions of impact that you can kind of derive from that. And you can see also some of these health impacts in terms of, in this particular case of Velcade, which was really based on NIH technology, it's been reducing days of hospitalization by 6 days per year per patient, which again, even though lymphoma is not tremendously prevalent, it is cumulatively a fairly significant impact in terms of quality of life and also the economic impact because a lot of these people then can go back to work faster. So if you go to the next slide, that gives you just kind of a brief idea. Again, the idea here is that we want to think about how do we characterize the impact that our research is going to have once its results are made public and diffused throughout the community. We want to think about a better way to measure that impact but then also think about a way to kind of discuss that impact in terms of really as a benefit to certain stakeholders, including the general public, and not just think about in terms of, oh yeah, we might somehow, cure cancer if we keep spending the money. It's better to think about what are the real impacts that happen as a direct result of the research that you can point to, and that you have some data to back it up. This study is actually publicly available on the NIH Office of Technology Transfer website. At that website, go to techtransfer.nih.gov, just put in public health and economic impact study. And I had a big team that was helping me out, so I really appreciate the time. In fact, I think Josh Fletcher is on this call, who was part of the team that produced this, one of my former colleagues. So I want to thank all of them, and we're happy to take questions at the end.
Great. So I'm Fred Ledley, and I think Jeff really set up this talk really nicely. Really nice piece of work he described. Our work, I have a background that spans a couple of disciplines, from medicine to originally a pediatrician, which I'll mention at the very end, and have worked in both academic research and also in early stage biotechnology companies. And what I'll talk about today is really represents a bit of a fusion of the way we usually think about federal funding for research, but also its interface with business and some of the business concepts that our colleagues in biopharma are more familiar with. So our research, if you go to the next slide, Adriana, thank you. We became involved in this question a number of years ago. We had done a lot of work looking at the relationship between basic science in general and applied science, which showed that one really needs to have a mature body of basic science in order to successfully develop a targeted therapeutic. This is a concept originates really in engineering, that the success of a product is very highly related to the maturation of the different components you use. And using those models, and also that math, we had shown developed models for the advance of basic science and shown that there is a threshold of basic science that's required to successfully develop a drug. Based on that, we asked who's paying for this, and the answer is not industry. This is occurring largely in the public sector. And in response to some congressional testimony that Francis Collins had put out in 2017, we went ahead and tried to see if we could characterize the scope of the basic science that was contributing to drug approvals. And our first entry was a paper in PNAS in 2018, where we looked at 210 drugs approved by the NIH over a period of time. And really, to our surprise, identified that every one of those drugs, we could identify federal funding for underlying basic science, and that the science consumed about $100 billion in federal grant funding, a much larger number than we expected, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. This was a bit of a sensation back in 2018 and was captured very nicely by Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro in the comment it's here. It just reinforced the notion that biomedical research is one of the most important investments a country can make. And that term investments popped up a lot in the congressional literature at that point and really began to drive our thinking. And next slide. So we have done this study several times. We've kept expanding our original data set. This is unpublished data from Dr. Edward Zhao in our group, which will be submitted very shortly, where we've now looked at all drug approvals over a 15-year period of time. We've identified NIH funding underlying those approvals for over 99% of all these drugs. And the total cost of the grants we identify continues to grow proportionally. Now, what we're looking at here is we're looking at NIH funding for published research. Unlike many others who try to characterize NIH funding by working backwards from patents or from clinical trials, those are great studies, but we consider those to be essentially applied science. If they're directly related to utility, if they're directly related to enablement, for those of you who have dealt with patents, that really approaches the definition of applied science. What we're looking at here is published research on the drug target. We use the target as a proxy for what you have to know about the biological system in order to believe that administering a drug which knocks out a particular function or enhances a particular function or alters a particular function will have a discrete therapeutic effect in the body without a lot of adverse events. And by focusing on published research, we're putting out a net that includes not only the sort of famous heroic work that we write about in review articles where people made discoveries, but recognizing that those discoveries are usually very competitive. They're usually a number of laboratories sort of racing to accomplish those endpoints. That research has to be replicated in order to be valid. In many cases, it might be refuted, and it certainly has to be refined. And the difference in a X-ray crystal structure of a protein sufficient to know what the protein looks like and versus one that you can actually fit a effective small molecule to is very, very different. So we're putting out a wide net, and again, it's based on evidence that until you have that, drug development is rarely successful. Okay, next slide. Now, so the problem with the slide I just showed you is it's full of numbers and decimal points and really hard for the public to appreciate. And I will say this point was really hammered into our heads just a year or so ago when Eric Topol took this really complicated data and turned it into the happy face on the right. And he put this up on social media and it got reposted about 6,000 times. And I will say Dr. Kat Cleary, who had done the original work here, whose PhD was in data visualization, was absolutely horrified because the nuance matters to scientists, but that's the version the public understood. And a somewhat more complicated version came out of Johns Hopkins on the left side. Again, this is the level at which the public cares about some of the nuance that I'm describing. Next slide. Now, the word investment really means a lot to us. I work at a business school, and investment as defined by the pharmaceutical industry is not the amount of dollars spent on something. And many of you perhaps have dealt with the question of, does industry really spend $2.5 billion on every drug they develop? And the answer is, by their rules, yes, that's the number that they consider the investment. And if we want to compare the scope of the public sector investment to that of the private sector, we kind of have to play by the same rules. And that includes, for example, considering both basic and applied research. It includes considering the failures of many drugs in clinical trials. Now, we believe we are capturing the failures, the things that get refuted in our basic science, but we also have characterized NIH funding for clinical trials, and we have some idea of what the failures would cost. And it includes, in the case of industry, something called the cost of capital. And this, in essence, is a normal profit. There's a lot of vocabulary that one can pick and choose from in here. But in essence, that's the amount of return on investment industry has to provide, or the money would never be offered in the first place. We don't have that concept in the public sector, but when government gives money to the NIH, they're actually using borrowed money. And the Office of Management and Budget suggests using a discount rate. There's several they recommend. We use a 3%, which in essence reflects the additional cost of borrowed money. When we calculate all of this, we come up with the average investment cost made by taxpayers is about $1.7 billion. When we compare that to industry's estimates, made by Olivier Wouters, this is what they actually report in their SEC filings. That is statistically indistinguishable from the amount of investment that industry is reporting to the SEC that they do in the investment in small drugs. The number on the right is interesting because if we would calculate this with the cost of capital, which doesn't make any sense for the NIH and the government, but that's how much money the government is saving industry by not making industry fund their own basic research. So if industry did this, they would have to spend, by their calculation, about almost $3 billion additionally on the basic science necessary to get a drug approved. So this is an enormous cost savings. Conversely, if industry did it, every company would keep that secret. They wouldn't necessarily share that with other companies, and you would get one drug out for all that work. We know that when the government does it and it's published, and it's required to be published either in the academic literature, and even if it's patented, it gets published. On average, 3 drugs get approved for that investment in basic science, so that the effective cost to taxpayers is much more efficient. This is a huge efficiency that it actually lowers the effective cost for taxpayers for every drug that they get the benefit from by a factor of 3. We actually think that number, which comes from John Overington and his colleagues, is probably a little bit low, and we're re-estimating that at the current time. So again, really complicated analysis. Here's the public version. On the next slide, Dana Brown just published this in a report out of the Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator, where she took all of that and she turned it into a really nice chart, sort of pointing out that this is in real dollars, not with the other multipliers I described, pointing out that the public and private sectors have very different roles in drug development. They're largely complementary. We are not fans of the idea that anyone's paying twice for this, but that this is in fact a very effective partnership between what the public sector is good at and can create economic efficiencies and what industry is good at. Next slide. So this is now the question now, as Jeff articulated so well, is what's the value being created? So in our view, you have this firestorm of knowledge coming out of the NIH. This is my chat version of the firestorm of knowledge exploding from the NIH. And what we calculate value using a model, which I'll show you very quickly in the next slide, which suggests that the only new value being created, and I'm using the term value here go back one. I'm using value here in a very accounting sense. Can you go back one, Adriana? And that is, we consider the new value being created to be the health value. That if that drug, when a person takes that pill, how much value do they get? Okay. This is akin to the way you would account for value in a financial statement. But in order to measure health value, we need units, and we use QALYs. And for this purpose, we recognize the questions and the potential biases inherent in policies. For this purpose, some of those are not operational, but we do recognize there are limits. So we take the number of QALYs gained for each person who takes the drug. We multiply that by the number of people who use the drug. This is using data on sales. This is real data, not theoretical data. We then multiply that by the value that comes from studies on consumers' willingness to pay for a year of healthy life. Again, this is the way it's done in accounting. What is something worth? It's generally the willingness to pay that you get by surveying consumers. There is a methodology to it. It has its own assumptions and its own limitations. So if we look at Keytruda, for example, there are actually now 6 drugs that work by the same mechanism as Keytruda. Okay, they have reported quality values between 0.4 and 1.8. The NIH invested, we believe, about $2.3 billion in the science on the PD-1, the programmed cell death receptor. When we multiply all this out, we believe that this drug to date, since approval, has generated 3 million QALYs. That's 3 million years of healthy life equivalent. And the value of that is to US populations is about $308 billion, right? Jeff pointed out the inadequacy of the 2.5 multiplier that's sometimes used. This is just one example of that. If you look, you guys can read the other ones here, but there are some very, very important drugs here, right? Harvoni is a remarkably effective drug. Xtandi is a little bit different because the NIH actually invested much of the money in the applied science as well as the basic science on the androgen receptor. But you can see that we're measuring the value generated in tens of billions of dollars for NIH investments that are in the, on average, about the $1 billion range. Okay, next slide. So how do we put this together? We put this together. We also believe, as Jeff said, the real issue is value. And while we now can calculate a total health value, we also recognize that value is now distributed among different stakeholders. And there is theory around something called total stakeholder value, where you can assess the value of something by adding up the different stakeholders. And we have a model developed by Dr. Paula Chavez da Silva in our group, shown on the left, where we recognize that health value you get from the drug is split between a residual health value or a net health value. Everything in business is net value, and the price paid. The price paid, much of which goes to the manufacturer, some goes to other companies. That is actually now split among different stakeholders as well. So we split it into 2 major categories, the social value and the private value. Social value, we think, includes not only health, but also the R&D that's performed, also the job creation, and also the money that's paid back to government or other nonprofits, for example, taxes. On the private side, much of that money is profit. Most of the profit gets written in checks to shareholders through dividends or stock buybacks. There's also value that goes to other companies, and I won't go into why, but the supply chain and the network and the consultants, it's all private value. And we can now add up the value to different stakeholders, recognizing also, and this is a very accounting-based approach. We're going through the financial statements. And if you go back to the example I showed of Keytruda and the other drugs, this is what we find, that they create enormous health value in the tens of billions of dollars. They also create jobs. They also create scientific value. And untold, it's about $47 billion of value for the social sector. We could call it public sector, but that word has different meaning to those of you in public administration. The private value, however, is about $140 billion. So from this, we're just beginning to look now. We don't think it's out of the question to calculate a return on investment in the same way business does, not the sort of broader return on investment that public administration sometimes tries to calculate. But again, we're talking about really enormous amounts of value arising because of the NIH investments in basic science. And with that, next slide.
I just want to let you know we're running a little behind on time.
Yep.
If you can
So
wrap up.
I'm out.
Thank you.
I'm out. You could track us down by the QR code or Bentley University, and I will stop.
Great. Thanks, Fred and Jeff, for your comments. Now, I'd like to give you a different view of the public value of investments in science and technology. So let me start by, Adriana, could you go to the next slide? So let me start by just giving you a quick overview. This is what I'm going to talk about, but in the interest of time, let me go on to the next slide. So let me start by setting some current context using critical and emerging technology areas. This first chart shows the relative level of publication activity in each of these 5 areas, which are artificial intelligence, biotechnology, nuclear technology, quantum, and semiconductors. So you can't quite see it very well, but there's a dotted line right in the middle representing a value of 1. So consider that like the average level of activity. So for example, on this slide, you can see that Germany has a much higher level of activity in quantum compared to the other countries here. The US, in contrast, is about average or below in most of these fields. China and India have relatively higher activity, which is one indicator of growing research capacity and focus in these areas. Could you just click, Adriana? Thank you. So now let's look at how that activity translates into one measure of impact, which is patents. Here you can see that Germany, the EU, the UK, and the US have high proportion of publications being cited in patents for quantum. For the US, what these two figures show is that the US has a strong position, but there is clearly strong global competition in these areas. Next. So this breadth and depth of US publications is a key feature of US performance in these critical and emerging technology areas. So this diagram shows the disciplines on the left that feed into these 5 areas. What's important here is not necessarily the size of the pathways, but the fact that there is such a cross-disciplinary mapping to each of these technology areas. So this really shows that the US impact on breadth and depth in fundamental research and is really necessary to advancing these critical technology areas. From a strategy perspective, investments in all the disciplines is important. I just want to point out that this data is from Scopus, so we're able to look at both the kind of the technology area as well as the disciplinary focus of the research. So now let me transition to the main focus of my remarks today, which is educational and workforce pathways. I want to say up front, I'm not likely going to show you anything new, but I do want to point out how policy decisions that we have made have led to current outcomes. And I hope to engage with you all on how we might strengthen our ecosystem. Go ahead, Adriana, next. So let me start with some reflections. In the last 50 years, higher education has been transformed in the US with greater interdisciplinary focus and the rise of global competition in the form of the strengthening of educational systems in other countries. But the US's continued investments and focus on research still means that we are a global hub for international students and workers. That is tempered by concerns about domestic pathways and the future attractiveness of the US relative to our competitors for global talent. On the workforce side, we've seen STEM workers grow from a small part of the US labor market to a significant one, including into non-STEM occupations. Employers in the US are now increasingly encountering global competition for STEM talent, while at the same time dealing with potential challenges stemming from changing immigration policies and priorities in the US. And perhaps one of the most interesting changes is how mobile STEM workers have become across sectors, across jobs, and economies. So now let me show you some data that illustrates some of these changes. Next. There are a little over 52 million bachelor's degree holders in the US. Of these, almost half have STEM degrees. I mean, that's huge, half, right? And most of these STEM degree holders don't actually work in occupations that we would recognize as science and engineering. But clearly, the labor market values them. STEM degree holders are highly sought after across occupational categories. Next. So here I'd like to show you another view of the US labor force, but parsing it by degree level. If we look at the entire STEM workforce, about half do not have a bachelor's degree. Of these, almost 2/3 were employed in STEM middle skill occupations, and by that, that's defined as occupations in healthcare, construction, production, installation, maintenance, repair, those kinds of the occupations that feed into those sectors. So what this means is that our labor force depends on STEM talent at all levels of education. Next. So let me shift gears a bit to talk about one way in which the growth of the workforce can be viewed. This figure shows how the number of STEM doctorates in the US workforce grew. It more than doubled between 1993 and 2021. The distribution of those doctorates has changed a little bit over time, but the defining feature is how industrial employment was dominant and continues to grow. Tenure track jobs for these workers have dropped significantly. Just click on the next figure, Adriana. Great. Right. So what you can see is between 1993 and 2021, tenure track positions went down, non-tenured positions went up, and industrial positions went up. Part of what drove this growth was strong federal support of science, engineering, and health graduate students. During this same period, the federal government directly supported almost 20% of enrolled graduate students in these fields, with higher rates in some areas. So, for example, in the physical sciences and engineering. Next. So in the time leading up to this webinar, I was thinking a lot about global competition, especially after you're listening to Jeff and Fred and what they were going to talk about today. But competition in education is related to the educational ecosystems we and our competitors have developed. So here's a quick comparison on a few features of the US, China, and Germany. I'll let you read this on your own, but I just want to point out a few things. The US is largely focused on four-year degrees with broad, flexible curricula. US education is valued for the development of creativity skills and critical thinking skills. China has been both growing and improving its system with an emphasis on rapid scaling to make programming available to more students. Germany's key feature is that they have incredibly well-defined dual pathways for bachelor's and higher degrees, as well as vocational degrees. What's interesting about this comparison is that each of these models has positive and negative features, but they do drive internal policies, and that has an impact. Next. And this is one way we can look at that impact. At the very highest level of educational attainment, the doctorate. China now produces more doctorates in S&E fields than the US or Germany. Germany leads in physical, biological, and mathematical sciences, while China has much more emphasis on engineering and computer science. And there isn't a blue bar for China because the Chinese data has computer science and engineering together. So the US position is more balanced with a larger proportion in social and behavioral sciences, and I'm very glad for that because that is where science policy lives, and that's what we're all talking about today. So what I really wanted to do today was to just show you this data to highlight how some of the trends that we're seeing in educational workforce pathways are a direct result of the policy decisions we've made, but also that we have other models to look at if we want to change our ecosystem. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you, Adriana.
Perfect. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions, but I just want to remind you about the webinar on June 3rd, where we're going to actually put some of this into practice. Again, we'll share the information and we can do some workshopping there. Okay, let me stop sharing.
I was going to actually take the second question first because I think the value is a more interesting question from the
Okay.
chat. But if you look at the chat, there's this reference to this article in Harvard Business Review, the $1 trillion R&D fix. This is kind of what I'm talking about. So no denigration to the author, but she uses a very well-respected economic method, a production function, to basically make the claim that she can maximize the market cap or share price of companies by telling them they should spend more money on R&D. And she uses regression analysis and historical data to say this. So she has these conclusions like, if Pfizer only spent $5 billion more per year on R&D, they would have a much higher market cap. This ignores the fact that one, Pfizer spends a lot of money on things other than R&D, and they would have to take money away from those things to get that $5 billion. It also assumes that like the same amount of money on R&D, by just increasing it, you basically get a linear increase in your market value, whereas in fact, you're going to be compromising the value of the company because you're taking money away from other essential things. So this is, in my view, a problem. It says that every dollar of R&D has exactly the same value. It contributes basically a stable number to that company, and you end up with these very perverse results, which is that if they spent all their money on R&D, they would obviously be a more valuable company, when we know that's actually not true in real life.
Okay, perfect. So since we're kind of running behind, I guess I want to make sure we answer the main question of this webinar, and which is how do we make this investment relevant to policymakers, especially we've been discussing specific topics, broad, and also with competition, right, with other nations, with a lot of trainees leaving for other countries, right? So maybe just quickly, how do you all see how would you answer this question?
So just my one comment on that is for policymakers, again, we should kind of get away from saying, oh, we need to increase the national R&D budget or the federal R&D budget by X% overall, and really start to think more about like, well, what are we going to emphasize and which parts of the R&D budget have certain value for certain people? I think at one point, the political system has to determine what the overall R&D budget is because it's a political process in Congress. But we can make a lot of claims saying like, oh, well, if you again cut social and behavioral economic sciences to zero, you're going to reduce the amount of R&D. You're basically going to impair the value of all of our research because we don't understand how it affects society. So I think getting to that idea of, again, looking at what is the actual impact on real people and stakeholder groups, you can probably get better political leverage from that than just trying to give them some kind of abstract economic number.
Maybe I'll ask Nimmi the same question since you're talking about competition.
Yeah, we have a lot of information and data. We've spent decades building it, right? We're decades putting together dashboards and all of that kind of thing. I think what we're really missing is the human element of it, right? Like when we talk to policymakers, we could have better data, we could have more data. I don't think that makes the difference. What makes the difference is exactly what Jeff was talking about, is tying it to that impact, telling the impact story, right? And it doesn't have to be the big global impact story. It can be the local impact story. It can be, how does this local university help the businesses that are located within 10 miles of it, because they're providing supplies and people and services. It's employing people. Those are the kinds of stories that we need to tell. And we actually have, I think in the chat, there's a question about, what data would enable, better monitoring of the system. I think we have most of that data. It's how we put it together and how we tell the story.
Yeah, and then I guess Fred, with your examples too, go ahead and respond, please.
Yeah, I really endorse much of what Nimmi just said, with two caveats. One is we don't have to teach people science, right? We somehow feel that if we explain it well enough, people will suddenly understand it. You need good one-liners, right? Ozempic came from studies in Gila monsters. Great. But that's not going to win the argument. It has to be human, whether it's human individual or human small business, you got to come back to people. We are just finishing a study looking at the budget cuts to pediatric research in the country, right? Kids matter. And hopefully the fact sheet we'll put out has a nice little 4-year-old drawing of a rainbow on it because people can relate to that. I put up the graphic of the smiley face because it has to be simple, right? It has to be really simple. It has to be things people are familiar with. I do like the concept of dollars because people think they understand dollars. I don't think they understand disabilities. They may to their grandparent or their brother or sister or cousin or friend, but the more we could express it in the same way it shows up on the evening news in very simple, I hate to use the word sound bites, but it has to be able to be reduced to something simple and human. And it is a distraction in many respects from what it is we want to be doing. Those of us who are studying the policy part, which is everyone on this call, this is what we do. But for the average scientist, it's a hard sell that not to just say, if I could explain what I'm doing, they would understand it. No, they're not.
Well, since you all brought up the people, I'm glad we're thinking about this sort of people-centric enterprise here. So, because I did want to ask a question about the workforce. I mean, we could just go whole hour on that. So, I guess in the sense of, the state of science right now and with the science brain drain that's going on, I guess I want to ask, what do you all think the workforce of the future is going to look like, or what would you want it to look like? Maybe we'll start with Nimmi.
One of the questions that I always heard, 30 years of my career was, do we have enough of or a shortage of STEM workers? And I think that that's not a useful question to ask. I think what we can see from the data, and this is a strength of the US system, going through a STEM program, regardless of the level, whether it's in a community college or a 4-year degree or higher, there's some features of STEM education that's really important. You learn how to frame a problem, you learn how to solve a problem, you learn how to work with other people, right? So if you think about it in that way, we have infinite capacity for people to gain these skills, whether through a degree or in some other way. So I don't think that question is needed. Now, how do I think about the future? I guess my biggest concerns about the future is, I showed you that slide where we had the comparisons to other countries and some of the ways that they have organized their educational and workforce pathways. I think there are some things to be learned there. And I think there are some things that we could take into our system to help it continue to diversify, right? We've had this big shift in the US to kind of 4-year degrees. But if I think about the critical and emerging technology areas for the future, some of the biggest needs are going to be in kind of middle skill levels. So how do we adjust our system to this changing labor market? And maybe, that's our great competitive edge in the future, is that we invest in like that variety of skill building. So, I'm still very optimistic for the future. But I think that, both for students contemplating what they're going to do, giving them more options, giving them more pathways, I think that's where we're likely to help people find their right spot. Not everyone needs to get a PhD. Not everyone needs to get a bachelor's degree. And so, helping people think through that and having those pathways well defined through policy, I think that would be helpful.
Perfect. And real quick, I want to hear from Jeff and Fred, and then we can wrap up.
So one example I will give is about the workforce is yesterday I heard the dean of a very well respected engineering school in the United States say that the number of incoming freshmen who have declared computer science dropped by 75% this year because, high school seniors are convinced that AI has made computer science obsolete. I don't think that that's true. But the thing is that it basically, the workforce responds to market signals to a certain extent. But what is really more important when we look at kind of the progression of technology is developing a workforce that has the flexibility to adopt new technologies and to understand that, as emerging technologies come out, we need to make some adjustments to how we operate. And so I think that the workforce we're looking at is a workforce that is equipped to deal with a lot of this potential disruptive change in the future and really understands critical skills like how to assess whether science is true, how to, adjust their way of working to new technologies. And the specialization is clearly important, but it's not everything.
Oh, I think, Jeff made a key point in there that the market is actually pretty good at getting people into the available jobs. That's one place it kind of works. If people have the capacity to make those adjustments. So I think there's, whether our K-12 system is giving people sufficient background to be able to make those choices is a serious question. I think the NSF has long been the leader of being sure there's enough math and science education in K through 12. It lags wildly behind much of the world. And at the school level, at the college level, one of the things that's been observed, and we've worked with people who do this, is people think they have a choice between business and STEM fields. And business is making it worse by claiming they're a STEM field. But we need to be sure that we're not just telling 18-year-olds that they can be academics for life. Right? For many, it's going to appeal to them. We have to teach them that being an expert in STEM is going to give them all the choices in the world, including the dollar signs that they're seeing their parents want them to chase. But also they have that option of doing academics. And too often it's seen as a binary choice. You either are going to be a scientist or you're going to go into business and make money. And that's the wrong choice to give 18-year-olds.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much for this great conversation, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks so we can do more of this and hopefully reach out to the speakers as well. We'll try to respond to some of the other questions. I know that there have been some responses in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.